Hello anatomists and physiologists. I want to talk to you today about water and electrolyte balance in the body. When we look at water balance, one of the important things is not only that our body has enough water totally, but also that it's found in the correct compartments in the right proportions. So when you look at total body water, depending on whether you're male or female, it may vary a little bit, but generally you should have 55 to 60% fluids, and the rest will be solids. When you look at just that fluid compartment, most of it is found inside your cells as intracellular fluid. So 2/3 of your total body water is found as your intracellular fluid. The remainder is found as your extracellular fluid, and this includes two parts. You have interstitial fluid, so this is the fluid that is surrounding your body cells, so it's indicated by the blue in here. And then you also have blood plasma, so the remainder 20% is blood plasma, so that's found inside your blood vessels. But both interstitial fluid and plasma are considered part of your extracellular fluid. Fluid balance between compartments is very important. You have barriers that separate your different fluid compartments. So you have the plasma membrane that separates your intracellular fluid from your interstitial fluid. You have blood vessel walls that separate your blood plasma from your interstitial fluid. And you do have exchange between these different compartments, so through capillary filtration and reabsorption, for example. But the proportion of the fluid should be approximately the same. And generally, you have approximately the same osmolarity between these different compartments. So while you do have fluid movement, there's generally not a big proportion change in that. And you have multiple processes that help to make sure that these proportions are maintained. You've got filtration, reabsorption, even just regular diffusion, osmosis. There's continual exchange between compartments. And you can see some of those exchanges here. So when we ingest water, it goes through our digestive tract. We absorb that water into our bloodstream. And as that blood carries that water and it circulates throughout our body, through the processes of capillary filtration, that some of that fluid will move into the interstitial fluid. Some of that fluid is reabsorbed back into the blood. And then within the interstitial fluid, you have movement just through osmosis into the cells and out of the cells. And that's just through osmosis. If you have excess interstitial fluid, then that can be picked up by our lymphatic system. It drains into lymphatic capillaries. And then that lymphatic system ultimately will return all of its lymph that it picks up back into the subclavian vein, and you return that to the blood. And so there are multiple ways that you can have fluid that moves between compartments. You lose about 2,500 mils of fluid per day. And so it's important to replenish that water. So this is just showing how you can lose water and how you can gain water. So we lose water continually through our feces, through expired air, just water vapor as we exhale, cutaneous transpiration, which is where you have water that is evaporating from your skin. And this is different than sweat. And this is just water that's constantly leaving your body in very, very small amounts. But over the course of a day, it does sum to a decent amount, 400 mils. You lose some through sweat. The most you'll lose through your urine. So about 1,500 mils a day is approximately how much you'll be urinating fluid out of your body. So it's important to replenish these losses. And so ways that you can gain water. Metabolic water, you end up producing water, if you remember, through the electron transport chain. That final electron acceptor is oxygen. You end up creating water from that process, so that's your metabolic water. When you ingest food, especially food that has a lot of water in it, such as fruits, you'll ingest some water through your food, about 700 mils. But the largest amount that you'll get inside your body is just by drinking water. And this is one of the reasons why having a water bottle around, making sure that you're drinking water throughout the day is really important. If you drink excess water, then that will just be lost through your urine later. So this is just a chart showing major ways that you gain water and major ways that you lose water. And they're approximately equal each day. The regulation of your water and solute loss is done through a variety of mechanisms. Obviously, your kidneys are going to play a major role in this, in excreting excess water, in regulating how many solutes you reabsorb into the blood compared to solutes that you lose through your urine. And the main factor that's going to determine what your body fluid osmolarity is how much urinary water loss you have. If you lose more water through your urine, then you will have a higher concentration of solute in your blood. If you lose less water through your urine, that water is returned to your blood, then your blood becomes more dilute, and that solute concentration will go down. There are three main hormones that will regulate your sodium as well as potassium reabsorption. Sodium as well as chloride reabsorption. Chloride tends to follow sodium wherever it goes, and so a lot of the hormones that will regulate sodium reabsorption will also regulate chloride reabsorption. So you have angiotensin 2 and aldosterone. Both of these are going to result in reabsorption of sodium as well as chloride, because chloride will just follow sodium when you're dehydrated. So you return these to the blood, and then water will end up following suit. Atrial natriuretic peptide has the opposite effect. It promotes excretion of sodium as well as chloride, and this will result in a decrease of your blood volume because water will follow that sodium on its way out into the urine. If you are dehydrated, there are two things that will happen. So dehydration means you're losing water, so you have a lower water volume in your body, but not necessarily solute loss. So you've lost water, but not necessarily solute. So if you lose water, this is going to have an effect on your blood volume. If you lose blood volume, that reduces your blood pressure. If you have reduced blood pressure, that's going to activate your renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And so through that system, angiotensin 2 actually, in addition to its other functions, actually talks to osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus, and that causes you to reduce how much saliva that you're making. In addition, that increased blood osmolarity, and remember blood osmotic pressure, blood osmolarity, that's referring to the concentration of solute in your blood. So you have more solute compared to how much water you have if you have increased blood osmolarity. So lack of water results in increased solute by comparison. This will also stimulate your hypothalamic osmoreceptors. So you have two different ways of stimulating those hypothalamic receptors. That is because of the reduced blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 will talk to your hypothalamus, and also increased blood osmolarity will talk to your hypothalamic osmoreceptors as well. Your hypothalamic osmoreceptors that are detecting this change in osmolarity will cause you to reduce how much saliva you produce, makes your mouth feel dry, and it increases your sense of thirst. So it makes you want to go seek water. It makes you want to go and drink. And this, if you drink, then that will help to correct your issue. So you feel thirsty, you drink a big glass of water. This helps to make your mouth feel better. It makes it moist, it makes it cooled off. This is also going to help to rehydrate your blood. If you drink enough, it helps to distend your stomach and fills it up, and that will inhibit your thirst short term. So if you drink a big glass of water and your stomach stretches out a little bit, that will inhibit in the short term. But as that water moves on through your digestive tract, the only thing that's going to really inhibit your thirst long term is if you have full rehydration of your blood. Otherwise, as that water moves on, if you didn't drink enough, then you'll feel thirsty again soon. Here's a review of your antidiuretic hormone mechanism. So if you have an increase in the osmolarity of your extracellular fluid, that's ECF, you'll have an increase in the sodium concentration in your plasma. That stimulates the osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus. Also, if your plasma volume goes down, which results in a decrease in your blood pressure, that stimulates baroreceptors, which are receptors that detect your blood pressure in your atria and also in your large vessels like your carotid and your aorta. That will also stimulate your posterior pituitary. So you've got osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus or baroreceptors that will stimulate your posterior pituitary, which will secrete ADH. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. It is going to talk to the collecting ducts of your kidneys. It inserts aquaporins in those cells. And because of all the countercurrent mechanisms that are present in the kidney, you end up reabsorbing more water. So you return additional water back to your blood. This will result in less urine because you're taking water out of the collecting duct that would have gone to your urine, and it's going to your blood instead. So your urine volume goes down. And because of that extra water that's being returned to your blood, you have a decrease in your extracellular fluid osmolality, and an increase in your plasma volume. So as plasma volume goes up, as your osmolality goes down, then that will inhibit the osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus, and you'll turn off your ADH secretion as your osmolality returns to normal. The osmolarity of your interstitial fluid should be very close to the osmolarity of the intracellular fluid. And so as you have movement between the compartments, then you shouldn't have net movement between the compartments. So your cells aren't going to shrink, they're not going to swell, because you have the same osmolarity in both compartments. If you change that osmolarity, that's going to change how much osmosis occurs in any particular direction. So if you increase the osmolarity of your interstitial fluid, so if the fluid around your cells has more solute and less water, then water is going to move out of the cells and your cells will shrink. If you decrease the osmolarity of your interstitial fluid, so if you have a higher proportion of water, less solute outside of your cells, then that means that by comparison you have a higher concentration inside the cells. So that water is going to be drawn into the cells will swell, and they potentially can burst if they swell too much. And usually the biggest reason for a change in osmolarity is because of a change in sodium concentration. And this is why the regulation of sodium in the body is so important. So here are two different water balance disturbances. And so this top picture is looking at what happens if you are dehydrated. So if you lose water from your extracellular fluid, so your extracellular fluid has water loss, you can see the water faucet being turned on in this direction, then your osmotic pressure rises. So again, if you've lost water but not solute, that solute is still remaining here, but it's not as diluted. You have a higher concentration of solute. And when I say solute, for the most part, there's sodium that's present. So because you have so much sodium here that hasn't gone anywhere and less water, the water that's inside your cells and your intracellular fluid is attracted to all that solute and it will leave through osmosis. If you have lots of water that's leaving your cells, then these cells will shrink. If they shrink too much, then they can die. So when you have dehydration, you have water moving in this direction, out of your cells, out of the interstitial fluid, and then you are losing water out of your extracellular fluid as well. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have too much water gain, this is called hypotonic hydration. And this is very difficult to do, but one example of when this could occur is if you very strenuously exert yourself. You run a marathon, for example, and you lose a lot of electrolytes, and then you replenish your body with only water but not the electrolytes. And then this is one example of how this could occur, but otherwise it's difficult for this to occur because your kidneys get rid of excess water. If you have excessive amounts of water that enter your extracellular fluid, so if you're drinking a lot of water, an enormous amount of water, that's going to cause your osmotic pressure to fall in your extracellular fluid. Again, you're flooding your extracellular fluid with plain water, and you're not adding any electrolytes, such as sodium. By comparison, you have more solute that's present on the inside of your cells. Water is going to move through osmosis into your cells, and you have swelling of your cells during hypotonic hydration. So you have opposite issues that occur, and it's just the direction of the water flow that's different between dehydration and hypotonic hydration. When you're dehydrated, there's could be two reasons for your dehydration. You could have water and solute loss, and so that's isotonic fluid loss is greater than the isotonic fluid gain. So if you're hemorrhaging, you're losing water and solute. If you have chronic vomiting, diarrhea, that's going to lose water and solute out of your body. Hyposecretion of aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone is responsible for water and salt movement. So if you're not secreting enough aldosterone, you're losing more sodium and water. So water and solute loss. So these are all examples where you have isotonic fluid loss that's greater than isotonic fluid gain. If you have just plain water loss, then you don't have any issues with your solute. Solute stays where it is. But because you're changing the water, you are going to see changes in osmolarity. So if you are sweating a lot, if you have ADH hyposecretion, so remember antidiuretic hormone is responsible for regulating water only, not solute, or if you have insufficient water. So you're continuing to lose water just through regular normal means, but you're not replenishing that water by drinking it. Then you have water loss that's greater than your solute loss. Your blood plasma will become hypertonic at this point, so too much solute, not enough water. For both of these, you're at risk for hypovolemic shock. You must maintain adequate blood volume so that you can maintain adequate blood pressure, so that you can have adequate perfusion of your tissues. You get oxygen, nutrient delivery, waste taken away. So both of these put you at risk for hypovolemic shock. Some signs that you could be dehydrated: if you have a cottony, dry mouth due to the decrease in salivation, oliguria, so if you are producing urine that is very low in volume, if you're very thirsty, if your skin feels very dry, these could all be signs that you need to go drink a big glass of water. Fluid gain can also be either with or without the solute. If you have just plain volume excess, this is with fluid and electrolyte gain. So if you have isotonic fluid gain, that's greater than isotonic fluid loss. And this is difficult to do, but it can happen if you've got renal failure, if you have hypersecretion of aldosterone. So if you have too much aldosterone being secreted, you're retaining too much sodium and too much water. So volume excess is involved with both solute and water gain. Hypotonic hydration is also known as water intoxication, and this was the second picture in that previous image that we saw. Again, this is difficult to do, but it's possible. This is just water gain, not solute gain. So if you have hypersecretion of ADH, where you're pulling too much water out of your nephrons and you're putting it into your blood, if you're drinking excessive amounts of water followed by excessive sweating, but you're not replenishing the electrolytes, then that's the example that I gave earlier. And then in this case, your blood plasma becomes very hypotonic because of hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is sodium levels that are too low, and hypotonic means a lower concentration. So basically your blood plasma is too watery and you don't have enough solute in there. You don't have enough sodium, usually, is the issue, hyponatremia. Both of these fluid gains can lead to nausea, vomiting, muscle cramps, and then also pulmonary and cerebral edema. Edema, remember, is just fluid gain in the interstitial space only. So it's not overall fluid gain, it's fluid gain that's only in the interstitial fluid. And so you see swelling just in that tissue. This can be due to capillary permeability. So during inflammation, your capillaries become extra leaky. It could be due to changes in capillary hydrostatic pressure. Maybe because you have leaky venous valves, if you've got a blockage in a vessel, too much blood volume, if you've got congestive heart failure, if you have too much hydrostatic pressure, that promotes capillary filtration. So you have more fluid leaving the capillaries and moving into the interstitial fluid. Also, if you have hindered capillary reabsorption, so if the capillary filtration is fine, but let's say you don't have enough plasma proteins, you have hypoproteinemia. You're not reabsorbing as much fluid back into the capillaries on the venous end. So if that gets messed up, then that could also lead to edema. Enemas are where you introduce a solution into the rectum to draw water and electrolytes into the colon. And when you do this, you increase the volume that's present in the rectum. And when you have volume, if you have substances that are present in the rectum, then that stimulates peristalsis. Peristalsis are the muscular contractions of your GI tract that move things forward, and so that peristalsis will help to evacuate your feces. This is a common treatment for constipation. You don't want to use these repeatedly. You don't want to use them in children without a physician's approval because you are losing water and electrolytes during an enema. So if you need to use it sparingly, then that generally is not a problem. But if you need to use them repeatedly, or if you suspect that a child may need one, you definitely want to talk to a healthcare provider first. That wraps up water balance. Let's talk about electrolytes. Electrolytes, when they dissolve, they form ions when they separate from each other. So a common one is sodium chloride, NaCl. If those separate, then you have the positively charged sodium and the negatively charged chloride. And there are lots of functions of electrolytes in our body fluids. One of the ones that we've already discussed is that they control osmosis of water between body fluid compartments. Sodium in particular is important for this. They also help to maintain the acid-base balance. Potassium is particularly important for this. Bicarbonate ion is important for this. Phosphate is important for this. They carry electrical current and also serve as cofactors for different enzymatic reactions. Magnesium is a particular one that's used in that one. The main difference between your two extracellular fluid compartments, which are your blood plasma and your interstitial fluid, is that your plasma has more protein anions, and so in particular those plasma proteins. And this is really important for maintaining your blood colloid osmotic pressure and making sure that you have enough water in your blood, because water is attracted to those proteins, and that helps to maintain water volume in your blood. When you look at the intracellular fluid versus the extracellular fluid, you'll notice that there is a difference in which ions are present on which side of the membrane. And one of the main reasons for this is because of the sodium-potassium pumps. The sodium-potassium pumps that are along the membranes help to make sure that there's plenty of sodium in the extracellular fluid because it's constantly pumping that sodium out. And then it's bringing potassium into the cell. So potassium is the most abundant cation in the intracellular fluid. Sodium is the most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid. And then sodium is also joined by chloride, the most abundant anion. And then in the intracellular fluid, you'll find proteins and phosphates that are your most abundant anions in your intracellular fluid. Here's a graph that just shows the relative concentrations of various ions in your blood and your intracellular fluid and your extracellular fluid. And so you can see sodium is very prevalent on the outside of your cells. Potassium is very prevalent in your intracellular fluid. A lot of chloride on the outside, a lot of phosphate on the inside. And then you can see some others that are listed here. Calcium doesn't have very high concentrations, but it's mostly located in your blood plasma and interstitial fluid, not really so much in your intracellular fluid, for example. Magnesium, on the other hand, more prevalent in your intracellular fluid than your extracellular fluid. Sodium is a very highly regulated ion in your body. It makes up 90% of the extracellular cations, and it accounts for most of the osmolarity of your extracellular fluid. And the two main hormones that will regulate it, although there are more hormones than just this, you've got aldosterone, which affects renal reabsorption. It pulls more sodium out of your tubular fluid and puts it into your blood. And then atrial natriuretic peptide does the opposite. It increases renal excretion. And there are other hormones that do regulate sodium, such as angiotensin II, but these are two of the big ones. Here's a reminder on how aldosterone works. If you have hyponatremia, which are levels of sodium that are too low, then that can stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. If you have hypotension, so low blood pressure, low water levels, low blood volume, then that will end up, you'll get aldosterone secretion, but through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Or if you have an increase in potassium levels, so hyperkalemia is too much potassium. So any of these variables could cause aldosterone secretion. Aldosterone secretion is going to talk to your renal tubules and cause you to increase how much reabsorption of sodium you have and increase how much potassium you secrete or get rid of in your urine. By increasing more sodium in your blood, you get less sodium and water in your urine, and so this helps to move that sodium and water to your blood and helps to raise your sodium concentration and also helps to maintain your fluid volume as well. And then a spike in potassium can also be dangerous, and aldosterone will help you to secrete that potassium and get that to leave your body in your urine. And then as your potassium levels return back down to normal, then you can inhibit the release of aldosterone that way. So aldosterone has a couple of different ways that will stimulate its secretion, and then it functions on a couple of different ions in your body. So it affects sodium reabsorption, it affects potassium secretion, it also affects your water reabsorption. Here is a review of ANP. So this is atrial natriuretic peptide, and anytime you see that natriuretic or natriuresis, then that is referring to sodium. So this is a hormone that is produced by the cells of your heart. If your atria are stretched because there's an increase in blood pressure, that is going to cause ANP release, and ANP does a couple of different things. It talks to the juxtaglomerular complex of your kidney, which decreases how much renin release you get. So basically, you're going to inhibit the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And so this is going to allow for more vasodilation because you're not going to have as much of that angiotensin II release. And remember, our initial problem that got secretion of this hormone was too much blood pressure, high blood pressure. And so by inhibiting angiotensin II, you get vasodilation, and that will help decrease your blood pressure because of the vasodilation. ANP is also going to talk to your hypothalamus and inhibit ADH release, antidiuretic hormone release. This talks to the collecting ducts in your kidneys, as ADH will not bind to the receptors there as much, and you're going to get a decrease in water reabsorption, which will result in a decrease in your blood volume. As you decrease your blood volume, you'll decrease your blood pressure as well. The other thing that atrial natriuretic peptide will do is it will talk to the adrenal cortex, which will inhibit aldosterone release. So this will be in addition to inhibiting the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism here by inhibiting renin release. It will also go directly to the adrenal cortex and inhibit aldosterone release there. And so aldosterone will not be able to have its normal effect on the collecting ducts of the kidneys, and so you're inhibiting sodium and water reabsorption that way as well. So all of these different mechanisms will result in dilation of your vessels and inhibiting the sodium and water reabsorption that takes place in the kidneys, which will lower your blood volume and therefore lower your blood pressure. So atrial natriuretic peptide does a variety of things to help you lower your blood pressure. If you have a sodium imbalance, you may have increased blood volume or pressure. You may have edema that occurs, and this is if your kidneys don't excrete enough sodium. So this might be due to renal failure, or if you have hyperaldosteronism. Too much aldosterone will cause too much reabsorption of sodium and water. Hypovolemia occurs if you have the opposite problem. So this is abnormally low blood volume, and this is usually due to not enough aldosterone release, inadequate aldosterone release, or if you've been taking too many diuretics, which you can purchase over the counter, that causes you to get rid of too much water, causes you to urinate too much water. So that can take away from your blood volume as well. Potassium is a very abundant ion present in your intracellular fluid. It's really important for establishing resting membrane potential in your neurons and your muscle fibers, helps to maintain fluid volume on the inside of your cells, and it also is important for helping to regulate the pH of your body fluids because it's easy to exchange potassium ions for hydrogen ions. Hyperkalemia is too much potassium, and that can cause death due to ventricular fibrillation. Potassium is regulated by aldosterone. If you get a spike in potassium levels in your blood, it stimulates the release of aldosterone, which causes secretion of excess potassium. Here is a picture that shows how potassium can change your resting membrane potential. So over here on the left, this is a neuron, and you can see there's normokalemia happening right here. So the level of potassium ions is normal. And you can see there's kind of flow in and flow out of these potassium ions, which are these blue circles. Potassium is constantly moved into the cell because of the sodium-potassium pump. Potassium also regularly leaks out of the cell because of leakage channels. But you can see there's kind of an equilibrium here. There's equal diffusion into and out of the cell. Although you find more potassium that's present into the cell, the movement is approximately equal in and out. And you can see your resting membrane potential right here. If you stick a voltmeter right here and measure the difference in charge between the inside and the outside of the membrane, you can see that this is normal. If you have hyperkalemia, so notice that the blue dots here on the outside are greater than the number of blue dots that we saw over here with normalkalemia. So hyperkalemia is when you have elevated extracellular potassium concentration, and because you have more potassium here, you have more potassium that is able to be moved into the cell. So notice you have a lot more potassium that's being moved into the cell this way. More positive charge entering the cell causes a depolarization. This is going to get you closer to threshold, and so your cells are going to be a lot more excitable than they normally are. So they're going to depolarize and send action potentials a lot more easily than they normally would. If you have hypokalemia, the opposite happens. Notice we have a lot fewer blue dots showing your potassium ions in the extracellular fluid here compared to normalkalemia. And so when you have a lower concentration on the outside in your extracellular fluid, these potassium ions that are on the inside of your cell will leak out a little bit more. So notice this arrow is a little bit bigger. And your sodium-potassium pump will still continue trying to move potassium into the cell, but you just don't have that much potassium to work with anymore. And so with more potassium overall leaving the cell, this results in a decreased membrane potential. And so this makes your cells hyperpolarized. It takes your membrane potential farther away from threshold. Your cells are less excitable, and it is more difficult to get an action potential from these cells. So the potassium levels in your extracellular fluid are able to affect your resting membrane potential and change how easy or difficult it is to get an action potential from your cells. Chloride is the most prevalent anion present in the extracellular fluid. It can move back and forth pretty easily between compartments because plasma membranes have a lot of chloride leakage channels and antiporters that allow for that movement. It can also help balance levels of anions in different fluids. A good example of that is the chloride shift in your erythrocytes. As bicarbonate is moving into or out of your erythrocytes, chloride moves in the opposite direction to help balance the charges. Chloride is regulated by any processes that affect reabsorption of sodium, because wherever sodium goes, chloride also tends to follow. Calcium is the most abundant mineral that's present in your body. 98% of your calcium is in your skeleton and your teeth. It's also found in body fluids as an extracellular cation, and this is the main reason why your teeth and bones are so hard. It's important also to have plasma levels of calcium because it's really important in blood clotting, neurotransmitter release out of the axon terminal, muscle tone, the excitability of your nervous and muscle tissue. So in addition to that calcium being stored in your teeth and bones, it's also important to have plasma levels of calcium. And hormones that help to regulate calcium. Parathyroid hormone will help to increase blood calcium levels. Calcitriol promotes reabsorption of calcium from your gastrointestinal tract. And then calcitonin lowers your blood calcium levels. Most of the phosphate that's present in your body is in your bones and teeth as calcium phosphate. Some of it is ionized as intracellular anions, and those ions help to serve as a buffer of hydrogen in your body fluids, and urine. So it's able to kind of soak up that excess hydrogen ion and acts as a buffer in your body. Phosphate is regulated by the same hormones that regulate calcium in the body. So parathyroid hormone inhibits phosphate reabsorption in the kidneys, and it also is regulated by calcitriol, which promotes reabsorption of phosphates and calcium from your GI tract. Bicarbonate is present in the extracellular fluid for the most part. It changes its concentration depending on where you are in the blood. As you move through the capillaries and you pick up carbon dioxide, most of that carbon dioxide is transformed into bicarbonate. And so bicarbonate is found a lot more in your systemic veins than in your systemic arteries. As you move through the pulmonary capillaries, that bicarbonate is transformed back into carbon dioxide, and so you see those levels drop off again. And then the chloride shift that we talked about before with chloride helps to maintain the proper balance of anions in the intracellular and extracellular fluids. And bicarbonate is regulated by the kidneys. They form and release bicarbonate, and you reabsorb carbonate in the kidneys. You can excrete it if your levels are too high. So the kidneys maintain your bicarbonate levels.